The music box sits on my desk as I record this, silent now, but I can still feel its presence watching me. 3 months ago, I would have laughed at anyone who told me that an antique music box could be cursed. 3 months ago, I believed in logic, reason, and explanations for everything. But that was before I brought this beautiful, terrifying object into my home, and before it started playing melodies that only my dead grandmother knew. Let me start from the beginning, because what happened to me defies everything I thought I understood about reality. My name is Sarah, and I live in Portland, Oregon, in a small apartment downtown that I've called home for the past 4 years. I work as a graphic designer. I have a normal life, normal friends, and up until 3 months ago, I had a perfectly normal relationship with the supernatural world, which is to say, I didn't believe any of it existed. I've always loved antiques. There's something magical about objects that have survived decades or even centuries, carrying with them the stories and memories of the people who owned them before. Every weekend, you could find me browsing through estate sales, antique shops, and flea markets, searching for unique pieces that spoke to me. I wasn't looking for anything expensive or particularly valuable, just items with character, with history, with soul. It was a cold Saturday morning in October when I decided to drive out to Hillsborough for an estate sale I'd seen advertised online. The photos showed a beautiful Victorian home filled with vintage furniture, classic books, and what appeared to be an impressive collection of antique musical instruments. The owner had been an elderly woman named Margaret Ashford, who had passed away at 93, leaving behind a house full of treasures accumulated over nearly a century of life. Hit the like button if you're getting curious about where this story is heading, because what I found at that estate sale changed my life forever. The Ashford house stood at the end of a tree-lined street, its Gothic revival architecture creating dramatic silhouettes against the overcast Oregon sky. Even in daylight, there was something imposing about the structure. Tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch you approach, intricate woodwork that cast complex shadows, and a wraparound porch that appeared to embrace visitors while simultaneously warning them away. I arrived early, hoping to get first pick of the items before the serious collectors showed up. The estate sale company had organized everything meticulously, with each room clearly marked and price tags attached to nearly every object in the house. I wandered through the parlor, admiring the mahogany furniture and crystal chandeliers, then moved into the library where leather-bound books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves. But it was in the music room that I found it. The room was filled with instruments from different eras, a baby grand piano draped in dusty silk, several violins in various states of repair, an old gramophone with a collection of vinyl records, and scattered throughout the space, dozens of music boxes in every size and style imaginable. Some were simple wooden boxes, others were elaborate carved pieces with intricate metalwork, and a few were clearly expensive collector's items that would probably sell for hundreds of dollars. And then I saw her. She sat alone on a small round table in the corner, separated from the other music boxes as if she were somehow special. She was about 8 inches tall and 6 inches wide, made of dark mahogany wood with intricate rose carvings along the sides and a mother-of-pearl inlay on the lid that depicted a young woman dancing in a moonlit garden. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every detail had been carved with obvious love and attention, from the delicate petals of the roses to the flowing hair of the dancing figure. But what drew me to her wasn't just her beauty. There was something else, something I can't quite put into words even now. It was as if she were calling to me, as if among all the people wandering through that house, I was the one she had been waiting for. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you exactly what I experienced in that moment. I picked her up carefully, surprised by how solid and heavy she felt in my hands. The wood was smooth and warm, as if someone had been holding her just moments before. There was a small brass plate on the bottom with an inscription that read, "For my beloved Elena, may this music bring you joy always. Harold, 1952. The price tag said $35. I couldn't believe it. Music boxes of this quality and age typically sold for hundreds of dollars, sometimes thousands if they were made by famous craftsmen. Either the estate sale company had made a serious error in pricing, or there was something about this particular box that made it less desirable to collectors. I should have wondered why. I should have asked questions. But instead, I picked her up and headed straight for the checkout table, afraid that someone else would notice the underpriced treasure and snatch her away from me. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had that feeling about an antique object, that sense that it was meant to be yours. The woman running the checkout was probably in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She took my money and wrapped the music box carefully in tissue paper, but I noticed she seemed reluctant to handle it, holding it as briefly as possible before placing it in a small cardboard box. "That's a beautiful piece," she said, but her tone suggested she didn't think beautiful was necessarily a good thing in this case. Mrs. Ashford was very particular about her music boxes. She collected them for over 70 years. "Do you know anything about this one specifically?" I asked, hoping to learn more about its history. The woman hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "All I know is that it was kept separate from the others." Mrs. Ashford's daughter mentioned that her mother never liked to have it in the same room where she spent time, said it made her uncomfortable. I laughed, thinking the old woman had probably just been superstitious. "Well, I think it's gorgeous. Someone put a lot of love into making this." "I'm sure they did," the woman replied, but her expression remained troubled. "I hope it brings you joy." The drive home should have been pleasant. I had my new treasure, the autumn leaves were beautiful, and I was already imagining where I would display the music box in my apartment. But as I drove through the winding roads back to Portland, I kept glancing at the cardboard box on my passenger seat. It was probably just my imagination, but I could swear I heard something moving inside, not the music box itself, but something else, something soft and persistent, like whispers too quiet to understand. By the time I reached my apartment, I had convinced myself that the sound was just the tissue paper rustling as the car moved. I carried the box inside, set it on my kitchen table, and carefully unwrapped my purchase. In the warm light of my apartment, the music box was even more beautiful than I had remembered. The rose carvings seemed to have depth and dimension that I hadn't noticed in the dim lighting of the estate sale, and the mother-of-pearl inlay caught the light in ways that made the dancing figure appear almost alive. There was a small golden key attached to the side with a delicate chain. I turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism inside wind tighter with each rotation. When I felt sufficient resistance, I stopped and lifted the lid. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a slow, lilting waltz that filled my apartment with an otherworldly sweetness. Inside the box, a tiny ballerina began to turn in perfect time with the music, her miniature arms extended in an eternal dance. But it was the tune itself that made my blood run cold. I knew that melody. I had heard it countless times throughout my childhood, hummed softly by my grandmother as she cooked dinner, as she tucked me into bed, as she worked in her garden. It was a song she claimed her own grandmother had taught her, a lullaby that had been passed down through generations of women in our family. My grandmother had died 5 years ago, and I hadn't heard that melody since. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories, because what happened next convinced me that some objects carry more than just memories. That first night, I placed the music box on my bedroom dresser where I could see it from my bed. The dancing ballerina had captured my imagination, and I found myself winding the key several times throughout the evening, each time transported by the familiar melody that reminded me so powerfully of my grandmother. My grandmother, Catherine, had been the most important person in my life. After my parents divorced when I was 8, I spent most of my summers and many weekends at her house in Eugene, a cozy cottage filled with the scents of lavender and fresh-baked bread. She had a way of making everything feel magical. Ordinary moments became adventures, simple meals became feasts, and bedtime became a journey into wonderful dreams accompanied by her gentle lullabies. The melody from the music box was her favorite. She called it Elena's song, though she could never tell me where she had learned it or who Elena was supposed to be. She would hum it while she gardened, her voice mixing with the sounds of bees and rustling leaves. She would sing it softly when I couldn't sleep, her words creating a sense of safety and comfort that I had never found anywhere else. When she passed away from cancer, I felt like a part of my soul had been ripped away. The funeral was difficult, the grief was overwhelming, but what haunted me most was the silence, the absence of her voice, her laughter, her songs. I would have given anything to hear her sing to me one more time. So finding a music box that played her melody felt like a gift from the universe, a tangible connection to the grandmother I missed so desperately. I fell asleep that first night listening to the gentle waltz, feeling closer to her than I had since her death. It was around 3 in the morning when I woke up. The music was playing. Not the distant memory of the music I had listened to before falling asleep, but actual music, clear and present, filling my dark bedroom with that familiar melody. I lay perfectly still, my heart beginning to race as I tried to understand what I was hearing. The music box was definitely playing, the gentle mechanical sounds mixing with the haunting tune, but I absolutely knew, that I had not wound the key before going to bed. Hit the like button if this is already giving you chills, because this was only the beginning. I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and looked toward the dresser. In the dim light from the street lamp outside my window, I could see the music box clearly. The lid was open, the tiny ballerina was spinning, and the melody continued to play as if someone had just wound the mechanism moments before. But I was alone in my apartment. I had locked the doors, checked the windows, and set the security chain before going to bed. There was no way anyone could have entered my bedroom and wound the music box while I was sleeping. My rational mind immediately began searching for explanations. Maybe the spring mechanism was old and unpredictable. Maybe the key had been wound tighter than I thought, and the music box had simply taken several hours to unwind completely. Maybe I was still half asleep and imagining the whole thing. But as I watched, something happened that shattered every rational explanation I could construct. The ballerina stopped dancing. She didn't slow down gradually as the spring unwound. She didn't stutter or hesitate. She simply stopped, in the middle of a turn, and rotated slowly to face me. For a moment that lasted either seconds or hours, I honestly cannot tell you which, the tiny porcelain figure looked directly at me. Her painted eyes, which should have been fixed and lifeless, seemed to focus on my face with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. The music continued playing, but now it sounded different, slower, more deliberate, as if someone were carefully picking out each note. And then I heard something that made me question my sanity. Humming. Someone was humming along with the music box melody. The voice was soft, distant, but unmistakably present. It was coming from the direction of the music box, but it wasn't my voice, and it wasn't coming from the mechanical workings inside the wooden case. It was a woman's voice, elderly and familiar, humming the same melody I had heard countless times throughout my childhood. It was my grandmother's voice. I tried to convince myself that I was dreaming, that grief and sleep deprivation were creating auditory hallucinations, but the humming continued, growing slightly louder, becoming more distinct. I could hear the subtle vibrato that had always characterized my grandmother's singing voice, the way she would emphasize certain notes and let others fade gently away. The music box played for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because I was staring at my digital clock the entire time, trying to anchor myself to something real and measurable. When the melody finally ended, the ballerina completed one final turn and stopped in her original position. The lid remained open, but the humming voice faded gradually, like someone walking away down a long hallway. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat in my bed with every light in the apartment turned on, staring at the music box and trying to process what I had experienced. Part of me wanted to get up and examine the mechanism, to look for loose springs or broken gears that might explain the mysterious activation. But a larger part of me was terrified to get any closer to the object that had just demonstrated abilities far beyond anything a simple mechanical device should possess. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because I was about to learn that this was just the music box's way of introducing itself to me. As the sun rose and normal morning sounds began to filter through my windows, traffic, birds, neighbors starting their day, the terror of the night before began to feel less immediate. In the rational light of day, it was easier to convince myself that I had been dreaming, or at least dreaming partially. Sleep paralysis can create incredibly vivid hallucinations. Grief can manifest in unexpected ways. Stress can cause people to see and hear things that aren't really there. I went through my normal morning routine, shower, coffee, breakfast, while carefully avoiding looking directly at the music box. I told myself that I would examine it more closely when I got home from work, that there would be a logical explanation for everything that had happened. But as I was getting ready to leave for the office, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The music box lid was closed. I distinctly remembered that it had remained open after the music stopped playing. I had stared at it for hours, noting every detail of its position, every shadow and highlight created by the street lamp light. The lid had definitely been open when I finally drifted off near dawn. Now it was closed, and sitting exactly in the center of my dresser, as if someone had carefully repositioned it. I stood in my bedroom doorway for several minutes, trying to remember if I might have closed it myself during my morning routine. But I knew I hadn't touched it. I had been deliberately avoiding the music box, afraid that handling it might trigger another supernatural episode. Someone, or something, had closed that lid while I was in the shower. I was already running late for work, so I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, but I couldn't concentrate on anything all day. I kept thinking about the music box sitting alone in my bedroom, wondering what other surprises it might have in store for me. My coworkers asked if I was feeling all right, and I made excuses about not sleeping well, which was certainly true if incomplete. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had an object that seemed to move on its own, because that evening, the music box began to reveal more of its mysterious nature. When I returned home that evening, I approached my bedroom with the same caution I might use when entering a cave that could contain wild animals. The music box was exactly where I had left it, sitting in the center of my dresser, but something about the room felt different. The air seemed thicker, more charged, as if a thunderstorm were approaching. I decided to conduct an experiment. I set my phone to record video, positioned it so it had a clear view of the dresser, and wound the music box key deliberately, counting the number of turns. 7 complete rotations, which based on my experience the night before, should provide approximately 3 minutes of playing time. I opened the lid, started the recording, and stepped back to watch. The familiar melody began to play, and the ballerina started her mechanical dance. For the first minute, everything appeared normal. The music box functioned exactly as it should, playing the sweet waltz while the tiny figure spun in perfect circles. But during the second minute, I began to hear something else. At first, it was so faint that I thought it might be interference from other electronic devices in my apartment. But gradually, it became more distinct. It was another melody, harmonizing with the music box tune, creating a duet between the mechanical song and something that definitely was not mechanical. The second melody was being hummed by the same elderly female voice I had heard the night before. My grandmother was singing along with the music box, adding harmonies and counter melodies that transformed the simple waltz into something infinitely more complex and beautiful. I had never heard her sing those particular harmonies before, but the voice was unmistakably hers. Every inflection, every breath, every subtle emotional nuance that had made her singing so special. The duet continued for the remaining minute of the music box's cycle, and when the mechanical melody finally ended, my grandmother's voice continued for several seconds, humming a gentle conclusion that brought the piece to a perfect resolution. Then silence. I checked my phone recording immediately, my hands shaking as I rewound the video and listened through earphones. The recording captured the music box melody perfectly, but there was no trace of my grandmother's voice. According to the digital audio, the music box had played alone, exactly as any normal mechanical device would. The harmonies I had heard so clearly, the duet that had filled my bedroom with supernatural beauty, had apparently existed only in my perception. But I knew what I had heard. I knew my grandmother had been singing with that music box, and I was beginning to suspect that she was trying to tell me something. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what happened over the next few days convinced me that my grandmother wasn't the only spirit connected to this antique music box. Over the next week, the music box's behavior became increasingly active and impossible to ignore. Every night, without fail, it would begin playing at exactly 3:17 a.m., always the same time, always the same melody, always accompanied by my grandmother's humming voice that only I could hear. I started leaving my phone recording all night, desperate to capture some evidence of the supernatural activity, but the recordings always showed the same thing, a music box playing by itself with no visible or audible sign of paranormal involvement. But what I experienced was far more complex than a simple mechanical malfunction. The music itself began to change. While the basic melody remained the same, the lullaby I remembered from my childhood, my grandmother's humming started to include variations I had never heard before. Sometimes she would add trills and ornaments that made the song more elaborate. Other times she would slow the tempo, making the melody more mournful and haunting. And occasionally she would sing actual words, though they were always too soft for me to understand clearly. I became obsessed with trying to decipher what she might be saying. I would lie awake each night, waiting for 3:17 a.m., straining to catch individual words or phrases. The singing always seemed to be directed at me, as if my grandmother were trying to communicate something urgent, something important that I needed to understand. During the day, I researched everything I could find about the music box's history. I called the estate sale company and asked for more information about Margaret Ashford, the woman who had owned it previously. What I learned made my blood run cold. Margaret Ashford had inherited the music box from her aunt in 1962. Her aunt had inherited it from her mother in 1943, and her mother had purchased it from an estate sale in Salem, Massachusetts in 1925. The music box had been passed down through a chain of women, and according to the records I could find, every single one of its owners had reported the same phenomenon. The music box would play by itself at night, always accompanied by what they described as the sound of someone singing along. But here's the terrifying part. Every woman who had owned the music box had also reported hearing the voice of a deceased female relative. Margaret Ashford claimed she heard her dead mother singing. Her aunt reported hearing her grandmother's voice. The pattern went back as far as the records could trace. Let me know in the comments if you think I should have gotten rid of the music box at this point, because I was starting to realize I was part of a supernatural legacy that stretched back nearly a century. I also discovered something else during my research. The inscription on the bottom of the music box. For my beloved Elena, may this music bring you joy always. Harold, 1952, had led me to investigate who Elena and Harold might have been. After hours of searching through old newspaper archives and genealogy websites, I found a death certificate that made me understand why the music box had such a powerful connection to deceased women. Elena Rossetti had died in 1952 at the age of 24, just 3 months after marrying Harold Rossetti. The cause of death was listed as complications from pneumonia, but a follow-up article in the local newspaper revealed more details. Elena had been a professional opera singer with a promising career ahead of her. She had been scheduled to audition for the Metropolitan Opera when she became ill. Harold had commissioned the music box as a wedding gift, intending to surprise her with it when she recovered from her illness. She died before he could give it to her. The music box had been created for a woman who never got to hear it play. It was intended as a gift of love that became a monument to loss, a beautiful object that had never fulfilled its purpose. And somehow that unfulfilled purpose had created a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. A conduit that allowed deceased women to reach across the veil and connect with the living women who owned it. But Elena's story explained something else that had been puzzling me. The ballerina inside the music box didn't look like a generic dancing figure. She looked like a specific person, with carefully crafted facial features and a distinctive hairstyle. When I found a photograph of Elena Rossetti in the newspaper archives, I realized that the tiny ballerina was a portrait in miniature. Harold had commissioned the craftsman to create a dancing version of his beloved wife, frozen forever in porcelain and music. The music box wasn't just playing Elena's song. It was Elena, or at least some essence of her, trapped inside the mechanical device that had been made to honor her memory. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because this realization helped me understand what my grandmother was trying to tell me. The next night, I prepared for the 3:17 a.m. concert differently. Instead of lying in bed and trying to record what I heard, I sat in a chair directly in front of the music box and waited with a pen and paper, ready to write down anything I could understand from my grandmother's singing. When the music began, I listened more carefully than ever before. My grandmother's voice was clearer that night, more distinct, and for the first time I was able to make out some of the words she was singing. Elena, she sang softly, harmonizing with the mechanical melody. Elena waits. Help Elena. The message was fragmented and cryptic, but the meaning was beginning to become clear. My grandmother wasn't just visiting me through the music box. She was asking me to help Elena, the spirit who had been bound to the object for over 70 years. But how do you help a ghost? How do you release a spirit that has been trapped in a music box since 1952? I spent the next day researching everything I could find about supernatural binding and spirit release. I read about objects that can hold souls, about unfinished business that keeps spirits anchored to the physical world, and about rituals that might help trapped entities find peace. What I learned was both fascinating and terrifying. According to multiple sources, objects that are created with intense emotional significance can sometimes absorb and hold spiritual energy. A music box made as a gift of love for someone who died before receiving it would be exactly the kind of object that could trap a soul. And if that trapped soul had been calling out for help for decades, it might be able to attract the spirits of other deceased women, creating a network of voices that could reach across dimensions. My grandmother hadn't just been visiting me. She had been recruited by Elena to help find someone who could break the supernatural prison that had held Elena captive since her death. Comment below what you think I should do, because the next night, my grandmother's message became much more specific and urgent. At 3:17 a.m., the music box opened as usual, and the familiar melody began to play. But this time, my grandmother's voice was different. Instead of the gentle humming I had grown accustomed to, she spoke to me directly, her words clear and unmistakable. "Sarah," she said, her voice layered with the mechanical music like a supernatural duet. "You must take Elena home. She has been waiting so long. Take her to Harold. Take her where she belongs." I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. This was the first time my grandmother had spoken my name. The first time she had given me specific instructions rather than cryptic song lyrics. "Grandmother?" I whispered into the darkness, feeling foolish but desperate to respond. "How do I help her? What do you want me to do?" The music continued for another minute, but my grandmother's voice had faded back to humming. When the melody ended and the music box fell silent, I was left alone with more questions than answers. She wanted me to take Elena to Harold, but Harold had been dead for decades. How could I take a spirit trapped in a music box to someone who no longer existed? But then I remembered something from my research. I had found Harold Rossetti's obituary from 1987. He had died at the age of 68 and was buried in Riverside Cemetery in Salem, Massachusetts. His grave was only about 3 hours from where I lived in Portland. My grandmother wanted me to take the music box to Harold's grave. It sounded insane, like the kind of thing that only happened in horror movies. But I had already witnessed enough supernatural activity to know that the normal rules of reality didn't apply to this situation. If Elena's spirit was trapped in the music box, and if she had been waiting for 70 years to be reunited with Harold, then taking her to his grave might be exactly what was needed to set her free. I called in sick to work the next day and began planning a trip to Salem. I knew I was about to embark on the most terrifying journey of my life, but I also knew that I couldn't ignore my grandmother's request. She had always been there for me when I was alive, and now that she was reaching out to me from beyond death, I owed it to her to help Elena find the peace she had been seeking for so many decades. Let me know if you want a part 2 to this story, because what happened when I took that music box to Harold's grave changed everything I thought I knew about love, death, and the power of unfinished business. The drive to Salem took me through some of the most beautiful autumn scenery in New England, but I barely noticed the colorful leaves or picturesque small towns. My attention was focused entirely on the music box sitting in the passenger seat, wrapped carefully in a soft blanket and secured with a seatbelt, as if it were a precious, living passenger. I had expected the 3-hour drive to be uneventful, but the music box had other plans. About an hour into the journey, as I was navigating through the mountainous roads of western Massachusetts, I heard something that made me pull over immediately. The music box was playing, not the full melody I had grown accustomed to, but individual notes, random and scattered as if someone were testing the keys of a piano. I pulled into a rest area and sat in my car, listening to the erratic musical sounds coming from the wrapped bundle beside me. The notes weren't forming any recognizable tune, but there was something urgent about them, something that reminded me of Morse code or some other form of communication. And then I heard Elena's voice for the first time. It wasn't my grandmother humming along with the melody. It was a younger woman's voice speaking directly to me with a slight accent that suggested European origins. "Thank you," the voice said, barely louder than a whisper. "Thank you for bringing me home." I sat frozen in my car, afraid to move or respond. This was Elena, not my grandmother channeling Elena's story, but Elena herself, speaking to me from inside the music box that had been her prison for over 70 years. "I have been waiting so long," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Harold? Is Harold there? Is he waiting for me?" "Elena," I said softly, feeling strange about having a conversation with a music box, but knowing that I needed to respond. "Harold died in 1987. I'm taking you to his grave. I hope that will help you find each other." The music box fell silent for several minutes. When Elena's voice returned, it was filled with a sadness that broke my heart. "He waited for me," she said. "All those years he waited. I could feel him waiting, but I could not reach him. This box, it holds me, but it also protects me. I have been afraid to leave it, afraid that if I let go, I will simply disappear." I began to understand the complexity of Elena's situation. The music box wasn't just a prison, it was also her anchor to existence. For 70 years, it had been the only thing keeping her spirit from dissolving into whatever comes after death. She had been trapped, but she had also been preserved, sustained by the love and intention that Harold had poured into her creation. "What happens when we reach the cemetery?" I asked. "Will you be able to leave the music box then?" "I do not know," Elena admitted. "But your grandmother, Catherine, she says that love is stronger than death, stronger than time. She says that Harold's love created this box, and only Harold's love can release me from it." Hit the like button if this conversation is giving you chills, because hearing my grandmother's name spoken by a spirit from the 1950s confirmed that the supernatural world operates on rules we don't fully understand. The rest of the drive was punctuated by occasional conversations with Elena. She told me about her life as an opera singer, about her dreams of performing at the Metropolitan Opera, about the brief but intense love affair with Harold that had ended too soon. She spoke with the vocabulary and speech patterns of someone from another era, using phrases and expressions that had been common in the 1950s, but sounded formal and old-fashioned now. But what struck me most was her loneliness. For 70 years, she had been conscious and aware, trapped inside the music box, able to observe the world but unable to participate in it. She had watched as the box was passed from owner to owner, had listened to the conversations of the women who wound her key and listened to her melody, but she had never been able to communicate with them the way she was communicating with me. The others, she said, referring to the previous owners, they could hear me, but they could not understand me. They would play my song, and I would try to sing to them, but they were too afraid. They would give me away, pass me along to someone else, hoping to escape what they could not explain. Why is it different with me? I asked. Catherine, Elena replied simply. Your grandmother opened the door. She spoke to me first, told me that you were someone who would listen, someone who would help. She has been trying to contact someone like you for many years, someone who would not be afraid, someone who would understand that love does not end with death. As we approached Salem, the temperature in my car began to drop noticeably. I turned up the heat, but the cold seemed to be coming from the music box itself, radiating outward like it was emanating from another dimension entirely. Elena's voice became more frequent, more urgent, as if she could sense that we were getting closer to our destination. I can feel him, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Harold is near. After all these years, I can feel his presence calling to me. The GPS directed me through the historic streets of Salem, past the witch trial memorials and colonial houses that had witnessed centuries of both tragedy and triumph. Riverside Cemetery was located on the outskirts of town, a sprawling collection of weathered headstones and elaborate mausoleums that stretched across several acres of gently rolling hills. I parked near the cemetery office and approached the elderly groundskeeper, who was tending to some flowers near the entrance. He was a kind-looking man in his 70s, with calloused hands and gentle eyes that suggested he had spent decades caring for this sacred space. Excuse me, I said, clutching the wrapped music box against my chest. I'm looking for Harold Rossetti's grave. He was buried here in 1987. The groundskeeper studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Harold Rossetti, he repeated slowly. Yes, I remember Harold. Sad story, that one. Came to visit every week for 35 years, bringing flowers to an empty grave. An empty grave? I asked, confusion washing over me. His wife's grave, the groundskeeper explained. Elena Rossetti. She died in 1952, but her body was never buried here. Harold bought 2 plots side by side, hoping someday he could bring her home. He never stopped believing he would find her remains and give her a proper burial. When he died, we buried him next to the empty plot he had been visiting all those years. My heart began to race as I understood the full tragedy of Harold and Elena's story. Harold had spent 35 years visiting an empty grave, mourning a wife whose body had never been recovered, never knowing that her spirit was trapped in the very music box he had commissioned for her. Hit the like button if you're starting to understand the cosmic tragedy of this supernatural love story, because what happened next proved that some bonds transcend death itself. The groundskeeper gave me directions to Harold's grave, and I walked slowly through the cemetery, following the winding paths between headstones that marked the final resting places of generations of Salem residents. The music box seemed to grow heavier with each step, and I could feel Elena's anticipation building like electricity in the air around me. Harold's grave was located in a quiet section of the cemetery, beneath a large oak tree, whose branches provided a canopy of golden autumn leaves. The headstone was simple but elegant, made of polished granite with Harold's name, dates, and a brief inscription. Beloved husband of Elena, reunited at last. But it was the grave next to Harold's that made me gasp out loud. The headstone read, Elena Rossetti, 1928-1952, forever in our hearts, forever in our music. Below her name was an engraving of a dancing figure that looked remarkably similar to the ballerina inside the music box. He knew, Elena's voice whispered from the music box, filled with wonder and love. Even without my body, he knew I belonged here beside him. I knelt between the 2 graves and carefully unwrapped the music box, placing it gently on the grass between Harold's headstone and Elena's memorial marker. The late afternoon sun filtered through the oak leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance across the carved mahogany surface. What do I do now? I asked softly, feeling somewhat foolish for speaking aloud in a cemetery, but knowing that Elena could hear me. "Wind the key," she said, her voice stronger than I had ever heard it before. "Let Harold hear our song one last time." My hands trembling, I reached for the small golden key and began to turn it slowly. I could feel the tension building in the spring mechanism, but there was something different about the resistance now, something that felt almost alive. When I had wound it sufficiently, I lifted the lid and stepped back. The melody that emerged was the same waltz I had heard countless times before, but now it sounded different, fuller, richer, as if it were being played by an entire orchestra instead of a simple mechanical device. The tiny ballerina began to spin, but her movements were more graceful than I had ever seen them, more fluid and alive. And then the most extraordinary thing happened. As the music played, I began to see transparent figures materializing in the space between the two graves. First, a young woman in a 1950s wedding dress appeared, her dark hair flowing in an unfelt breeze, her face radiant with joy and anticipation. This was Elena, not the trapped spirit I had been speaking with, but Elena as she had been in life, beautiful, vibrant, and full of hope. Comment below what you think happened next, because what I witnessed challenged everything I thought I knew about the afterlife. Moments later, a second figure began to take shape, a tall man in a vintage suit, his face lined with the passage of time, but his eyes bright with love and recognition. Harold looked exactly as he had in the 1980s photographs I had found in the newspaper archives, aged by decades of waiting but unmistakably the same man who had commissioned this music box as a gift for his beloved wife. The two spirits moved toward each other slowly, as if they were afraid that sudden movements might break the spell that had finally allowed them to meet again. When they were close enough to touch, Harold reached out his translucent hand and gently cupped Elena's face, his thumb brushing away tears that sparkled like starlight in the afternoon sun. "My darling," Harold's voice whispered on the wind, barely audible but filled with 70 years of longing. "I knew you would come home to me." "I tried to reach you," Elena replied, her spirit form becoming more solid as she spoke. "For so many years, I called out to you, but the music box, it held me, trapped me between worlds." "I heard you," Harold said, his spirit moving closer to hers. "Every night I heard you singing. That's why I came here every week, why I never stopped hoping. I could feel you trying to come home." The music box continued to play, but now it was accompanied by the sound of other voices, dozens of them, hundreds of them, creating a supernatural chorus that filled the cemetery with the most beautiful harmony I had ever heard. I realized that all the spirits connected to the music box's history were present, including my grandmother Catherine, who appeared at the edge of my vision and smiled at me with infinite love and gratitude. Let me know in the comments if you've ever witnessed something that changed your understanding of death, because what happened in those final moments showed me that love truly is eternal. Harold and Elena's spirits began to glow brighter, their forms becoming more solid and real as they embraced. The music box melody reached a crescendo, and I watched in amazement as the tiny ballerina inside the box began to glow with the same ethereal light as the spirit standing before the graves. "Thank you, Sarah," Elena's spirit said, turning to look at me one final time. "Thank you for bringing me home. The music box no longer needs to hold me. I am free to go where I belong." The light around the two spirits grew brighter and brighter until I had to shield my eyes from the intensity. When the light finally faded, Harold and Elena were gone, but I could still feel their presence in the warm breeze that rustled through the oak leaves and in the sense of peace that had settled over the cemetery. The music box had fallen silent. I approached it carefully and looked inside. The tiny ballerina was still there, but she was no longer moving. Her painted eyes, which had seemed so alive and intelligent for weeks, now appeared fixed and lifeless, like any normal mechanical figurine. The magic, the supernatural energy that had animated the music box for over 70 years, was finally at rest. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories, because the aftermath of this experience taught me that sometimes the most frightening supernatural encounters are actually acts of love spanning multiple lifetimes. I drove home from Salem that evening in complete silence, the music box sitting motionless in the passenger seat. The supernatural weight that had seemed to press down on it for weeks was gone, replaced by the simple presence of a beautiful antique object with no power beyond its exquisite craftsmanship. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt an overwhelming sense of loss, as if I had just said goodbye to friends I would never see again. The first night back in my apartment was the quietest I had experienced since bringing the music box home. At 3:17 a.m., I woke up automatically, my internal clock still programmed to expect the supernatural concert that had become such a regular part of my life. But my bedroom remained silent, filled only with the ordinary sounds of a city at night, distant traffic, the hum of appliances, the occasional siren in the distance. I sat up in bed and looked at the music box sitting on my dresser. In the dim light from the street lamp, it appeared exactly as it had on that first day I brought it home from the estate sale. Beautiful, mysterious, but ultimately just an object made of wood and metal and mother-of-pearl inlay. I wound the key and lifted the lid, and the familiar melody began to play, but now it sounded hollow, mechanical, devoid of the supernatural richness that had characterized every previous performance. The tiny ballerina spun in her predictable circles, her movements precise but lifeless. There was no humming voice to accompany the music, no sense of spiritual presence filling the room, no feeling that I was participating in something magical and otherworldly. The music box had returned to being exactly what it appeared to be, a mechanical device designed to play a simple melody. But even though the supernatural activity had ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had been permanently changed by the experience. I had witnessed something that challenged every assumption I had ever made about death, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. I had heard the voices of the dead, had watched spirits materialize before my eyes, and had played a crucial role in reuniting two souls who had been separated by the cruel timing of mortality. Over the following weeks, I found myself researching everything I could about near-death experiences, afterlife communications, and the scientific theories that might explain what I had witnessed. I read about quantum physics concepts like consciousness surviving bodily death, about the possibility that emotional energy could imprint itself on physical objects, and about the growing body of evidence suggesting that death might not be the absolute ending most people believe it to be. Let me know in the comments if this experience has changed how you think about death and the afterlife, because what I learned in the months that followed convinced me that my encounter with Elena and Harold was part of a much larger supernatural reality. I also began to pay attention to stories from other people who claim to have had similar experiences. I joined online forums dedicated to paranormal encounters, read books written by people who had communicated with deceased relatives, and even attended a few seances and psychic readings, hoping to understand more about the world I had briefly glimpsed through the music box. What I discovered was that my experience, while unique in its specific details, was part of a much larger pattern of supernatural encounters that people have been reporting throughout human history. Across cultures and centuries, there are consistent accounts of objects that serve as conduits between the living and the dead, of spirits who remain earthbound due to unfinished business, and of love that transcends the boundaries of mortality. The music box itself became a different kind of treasure for me. Even though it no longer exhibited any supernatural properties, it remained a tangible reminder of the extraordinary weeks when my apartment had been visited by spirits from beyond the grave. I kept it on my dresser, winding it occasionally, and listening to Elena's melody, remembering the nights when that same tune had been accompanied by my grandmother's voice and Elena's desperate attempts to communicate her need for help. But perhaps the most significant change in my life was my relationship with grief and loss. Before my experience with the music box, my grandmother's death had felt like an absolute ending, a permanent separation that left me feeling disconnected from one of the most important relationships of my life. The supernatural encounters had shown me that death might be more like a change of address than a final goodbye, that the love and connection I had shared with my grandmother continued to exist even though her physical presence was gone. I began visiting my grandmother's grave regularly, not with the desperate sadness that had characterized my previous visits, but with a sense of continuing relationship and communication. I would sit beside her headstone and tell her about my life, my work, my hopes and fears, trusting that somehow she could hear me even if she could no longer respond in ways that I could perceive with my ordinary senses. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message about love transcending death, because the insights I gained from this experience extended far beyond my own personal healing. I also started paying more attention to the antique objects I encountered in my weekend browsing expeditions. I learned to be more sensitive to the emotional history that vintage items might carry, to approach them with respect for the lives and stories they had witnessed. I never again encountered anything as dramatically supernatural as Elena's music box, but I did find several items that seemed to carry subtle traces of their previous owner's energy. A wedding ring that made me feel inexplicably sad, a photograph that seemed to watch me from across the room, a vintage diary that felt warm to the touch even in a cold antique shop. These experiences taught me to be more open to the possibility that the physical world is constantly intersecting with spiritual dimensions that most people simply don't notice or acknowledge. I began to understand that supernatural encounters might be happening around us all the time, but that our culture's emphasis on rational, scientific explanations often prevents us from recognizing or accepting them. The music box also led me to research the broader history of Salem, Massachusetts, and its long association with supernatural phenomena. I learned about the witch trials of the 1690s, about the generations of psychics and mediums who had been drawn to the area, and about the numerous reports of ghostly encounters that continued to be documented in the historic city. I began to understand that Salem's reputation for supernatural activity wasn't just based on historical events from centuries ago, but on an ongoing pattern of spiritual encounters that suggested certain locations might be more conducive to communication between the living and the dead. Comment below if you've ever felt drawn to visit a place with supernatural history, because my research into Salem led me to understand that geography itself might play a role in paranormal phenomena. As months passed, I occasionally received emails and messages from people who had watched videos or read articles about paranormal encounters similar to mine. Some shared their own stories of objects that seemed to be haunted. Others asked for advice about how to help spirits who seemed to be trying to communicate with them, and a few expressed skepticism about the entire concept of supernatural activity. I tried to respond to each message thoughtfully, sharing what I had learned from my experience while acknowledging that not everyone would interpret these phenomena in the same way. I emphasized that my goal was not to convince anyone to believe in ghosts or spirits, but simply to share my honest account of what had happened to me and to suggest that there might be more to reality than our ordinary perceptions reveal. The music box continues to sit on my dresser, a beautiful reminder of one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. Occasionally, late at night when I'm feeling particularly connected to the spiritual insights I gained from Elena and Harold's story, I wind the key and listen to the familiar melody, remembering the nights when that tune was accompanied by voices from beyond the grave. But even more importantly, the experience taught me to pay attention to the subtle ways that love and connection continue to manifest in my life, even when the people I care about are no longer physically present. I've learned to notice the unexpected songs on the radio that remind me of my grandmother, the dreams that feel more like visits than ordinary sleep experiences, and the moments of synchronicity that suggest my deceased loved ones might still be finding ways to communicate with me. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced any signs that your deceased loved ones are still with you, because I've come to believe that these connections are far more common than most people realize. The music box taught me that love is indeed stronger than death, that consciousness might survive the dissolution of the physical body, and that objects created with deep emotional intention can serve as bridges between worlds that most people believe are permanently separated. It showed me that sometimes the most terrifying supernatural encounters are actually profound acts of love, and that helping trapped spirits find peace can be one of the most meaningful ways to honor both the living and the dead. Most importantly, it taught me to approach the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, to remain open to possibilities that challenge conventional understanding, and to trust that the universe operates according to principles of love and connection that transcend our limited human comprehension of how reality is supposed to work. If you've made it to the end of this story, I want to thank you for listening to my account of these extraordinary events. Whether you interpret them as literal supernatural encounters or as symbolic representations of grief, healing, and the power of love to transcend loss, I hope that Elena and Harold's story has touched your heart and perhaps opened your mind to new possibilities about the nature of life, death, and the connections that bind us together across all dimensions of existence. The music box may be silent now, but the lessons it taught me about love, loss, and the resilience of the human spirit continue to resonate through every aspect of my life. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I wind that golden key and listen to Elena's melody, I swear I can still hear the faintest echo of my grandmother's voice, humming along with the tune and reminding me that love never really dies. It just changes form and finds new ways to make itself known to those who are willing to listen. Subscribe for more true supernatural stories, hit that notification bell, and remember, the most beautiful hauntings are often stories of love that refuse to be silenced by death itself.